This is the first of the mini videos for key issues in peace and conflict studies, so welcome to the show. And in the next few minutes I'm going to discuss some of the implications for peace and conflict studies of the key issue, the key concept of conflict. What do we mean by conflict? And we could do worse than take a starting point in news reporting. My old stamping ground as a former journalist. And in news reporting, it's a virtue to use different words meaning the same thing to make writing more interesting for readers and audiences. So you will often see the phrases conflict and war used interchangeably as if they are synonymous. One example would be in this piece of BBC reporting from its website that I'm going to post on Blackboard, which I'll just crane across now and read from. As you can see, I think it's about the war in Syria, and if I just scroll down a bit, you can read, why is there a war in Syria? And it says, long before the conflict began, many Syrians complained about high unemployment, widespread corruption, a lack of political freedom, and a state of repression under President Bashar al-Assad. Now, that's obviously a quite useful primer to some of the background issues in the Syrian conflict, but it is using the words war and conflict to mean the same thing, because it says the conflict began at an identifiable point in time. But some of the ills it describes, like the high unemployment and the repression and so forth, in peace and conflict studies, we actually see those as conflict issues. In other words, they are themselves part of the conflict. Now, I'm going to switch now to the PowerPoint and show you a diagram of what we mean by conflict, how conflict can be conceptualized to include some of those issues. So just bear with me. So if I go to PowerPoint and then View, I'm going to put it on slideshow and flick forward a few slides. There. So that's the PowerPoint that I'll put on the Blackboard site. And as you can see, it shows something called the ABC conflict triangle. And in peace and conflict studies, conflict is not the same as war. Conflict is defined as a relationship between two or more parties who have, or think they have, incompatible goals. Incompatible goals. And one of the issues, perhaps, in the Syria conflict is that increasing numbers of people began to see their goals for a decent paying job, for security of employment, for the freedom to think and speak as dictated by the following their conscience. They began to see contradictions between those goals and, on the other hand, the goal of the Assad government to remain in power and to keep on using the power structures in which it had become embedded over so many years. But that relationship is not the same as war. That relationship precedes the war. It was already there. The conflict was already there before the violence began. So that's the C of the ABC conflict triangle, the contradiction. And the contradiction provides a context within which people respond. And their responses can be gathered under the two headings of attitudes and behaviours. Some of the very familiar presenting symptoms of conflict, which feature regularly in the news, including, sadly, from Syria, are, of course, in the category of violent behaviours, and they should be seen as responses to the conflict. So that's quite important. We can have conflict without violence, and what that means also is that conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. If you think about it, change is conflictual. We're probably all familiar with change. You may feel that some changes in your life are more agreeable than others. Changes in your family situation, changes at work. Many of us are probably in professional settings which are subject to processes of organisational change, and some of those changes are welcome and others less so. And therefore, anything which is a process of change will suit some people more than others, and therefore set up potential conflicts of interest, conflicts of incompatible goals. But on the other hand, just think of the prospect that would face you if we lived in a society where nothing ever changed. You could probably all think of changes that you would like to see or like to bring about. And indeed, if nothing ever changed, that itself would be conflictual, because some people would want things to be changed and others wouldn't. What that means is that conflict is all around us. Conflict is a fact of life. You could even say it's one of the conditions of our existence. And generally speaking, we're probably, most of us, in a situation where we feel that changes are handled and changes bed down in a fairly acceptable fashion. Consensus is often sought, agreement is often reached, and we successfully absorb the change and move on. Now, what that means is that we are living with conflict, but we are succeeding in managing it. We're succeeding in handling it. We're responding to the conflict without violence. And that's very important, because, of course, that's what we want in peace and conflict studies, because, as we've seen, peace and conflict studies has a positive valuation of peace. So if people can respond to conflict without recourse to violence, then that is an essential attribute and ability for bringing about peace. But in order to get that, in order to visualize it, we have to allow for conflict and call for responses to conflict to be non-violent. If we set out with a vision of peace which entailed an absence of conflict, it would be too big an ask. It would be impossible. We'd be making an impossible demand. And what we want is for peace to be difficult and demanding, but not utopian. That is, not impossible to get to. So it would be futile to require an absence of conflict, but we can perhaps call for an absence of violence. And if we call for an absence of violence, then that of course begs the question, what do we mean by violence? And that's the subject of the next video.